My doctor said that defibrillator saved his life.
Yeah. All right, y'all, here we go. We are picking up with Philemon. And fascinating, very personal letter from Paul to an individual. So, we do have Paul's letters to Titus and Timothy, but here this is interesting because this takes a different tone. And the letter was delivered by a man named Onesimus. So Onesimus carried the letter. Paul probably met Philemon during his time when he was in Ephesus in the early 50s. And he became a Christian and returned to his hometown of Colossae. So that's where he is. And he opened his home for a church. So this is a guy that's letting a church meet in his house. And this guy Onesimus was a bondservant of Philemon's. Now I talked a little bit about this last week. This is not the same as like chattel slavery, but you did have obligations and you were sort of the property of the person that you were under this contract with, if you will. But at some point, Onesimus runs away. He runs away. And somehow he managed to connect with Paul. We have no idea what this story is, but it's the kind of thing God does. And he became a Christian and became a great asset of Paul's, particularly while Paul was under house arrest in Rome. But, Paul gets to know him, and he's telling Paul his story, obviously, because Paul knows what's happening. And so Paul learns that he had fled Philemon, and he told him, you got to go back. This is an obligation you have. You owe this to this man for whatever reason. Remember, people could sell themselves to pay off a debt or whatever to somebody. And, he made this agreement with Philemon, and he said, you got to go back and make this right. You can't just walk away. And so he tells him to go back, but so Paul writes the letter that we know as Colossians. So he wrote the letter for the church at Colossae, and he also wrote this letter. And he gave these letters to Onesimus, and he took them to Colossae to deliver them. And he's got this personal letter for Philemon. And I just wonder what this looked like, when Onesimus shows up at Philemon's house. Because Philemon doesn't know what's going on with Onesimus at this point. How's he going to know? And he wasn't on social media back then, hanging out with Paul. And so here he is, and in the letter, Paul urges Philemon to receive Onesimus back, but he says, I'm going to ask you to receive him back not as a slave, but as a brother. So he's making Onesimus do the right thing, and Philemon doesn't have to accept him back that way. But Paul just tells him, look, I'm asking you to do this. Receive him back as a brother. In fact, a beloved brother is what he calls. And he says, you need to treat him the same way you would treat me. And if he owes you anything, I'll pay it when I get there. Well, what's Philemon going to do now? Well, yeah, Paul, you got to pay this guy's debt. He's not going to do that, obviously. But this little letter is, I think, a great encouragement for three things. Number one, it's a great encouragement for taking responsibility when we've done something, when we have a wrong that we need to right. And I think that's a timeless principle we see in Scripture, that Onesimus ran out on him for whatever reason. Could have been Philemon wasn't treating him well. Could have been he was just rebellious. Who knows? But you got to go back and make it right. The second is forgiving people who wronged us. Because the truth is, he did owe Philemon. Philemon didn't get out of him what he was supposed to get. But Paul's encouraging him, look, just take him back as your brother, not as your slave. And then third, I think the third lesson is that we should be peacemakers to help others reconcile. That's what Paul's doing here. He could have just said, hey, Philemon, or hey, Onesimus, go home and take your lumps. But he didn't. What he's doing is he's trying to reconcile these two guys that for whatever reason, this separation happened, he ran away, and he's trying to bring them into reconciliation as brothers in Christ. And that's really something that as Christians, I don't think we talk enough about, that we need to do to try to help be peacemakers, because I think a lot of times what we do is we take sides, when brothers and sisters are at odds, and sometimes we can even pour gas on a fire, when what we need to be doing is, and you know, the thing is, Philemon had been wronged. And what we need to be doing when somebody has been sinned against by somebody else is we need to be encouraging forgiveness. And when somebody has done wrong to somebody, we need to encourage them to do what they have to do to make it right. Even not knowing the outcome, they still need to do what they do to make it right. So I think it's just a sweet little letter, and it's some great lessons for us. We're going to spend the remainder of the time talking about not a sweet little letter, but an incredibly long letter. The letter to the Hebrews. It's really, really fascinating. Now, in case you don't know, we don't know who wrote it. Okay? We don't know who it was written to exactly. But there are clues. So even though we're not going to be able to identify the author, we can learn some things about the author. And even though we can't be certain about the recipients, there's some clues to give us a pretty high confidence level of who they at least could have been. So the author was probably Jewish because he had an extensive knowledge of the Old Testament. Now, it could have been that he was a Gentile convert, but he really knew the Old Testament. And as I'll talk about in a minute, he's probably writing to Jewish people. So it would make sense that a Jewish man would be the one to have this credibility with them. We also know he's male because he uses masculine pronouns. He was probably not an eyewitness of Jesus, since he says he learned about salvation from, quote, those who heard. So it was not one of the apostles, including, I'm convinced it was not Paul. In fact, for a long time people thought it was Paul, but I don't think anybody thinks it was Paul anymore. But it was somebody who did have some credibility. The recipients were probably, at least predominantly, Jewish, because the Old Testament is throughout, and he's using Old Testament arguments to convince them of what he's trying to convince them of, which I'll get to in a second. And he's also comparing Jesus to all things Jewish. It doesn't make sense that he would do that if these were just a bunch of Gentiles who had converted, but they were Jewish converts. They were probably in Italy, because in chapter 13, verse 24, the writer says those who are from Italy, those who come from Italy send you greetings. So some have suggested that Paul was actually in Italy saying, hey, the Italians are giving you greetings. But the wording there, those who come from Italy, seems to indicate that they weren't in Italy then. They had come from there. And so the general consensus, you won't ever find 100% agreement on anything, but the general consensus is that the writing is to people in Rome, to a church in Rome. So most people believe that this was a Jewish man, obviously a Christian, a convert, writing to Jewish background believers in Rome. As for the date, we don't know for certain, but it was probably before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the reason I say that is because when he talks about the sacrifices, the way he talks about the sacrifices seem to indicate they're still going on. And once the temple was trashed in 70 AD, once it was destroyed, sacrifices were suspended because there was no place to do them. And it was probably not a lot earlier. That was in 70. It probably wasn't a whole lot earlier, because there's some persecution going on. And that really kind of started in Rome under Nero in the 60s. And so the general consensus is that here's a Jewish man writing to a church that is predominantly made up of Jewish believers in Rome. Do we know that with absolute certainty? We don't know any of those things with absolute certainty, but that's what's likely. Apparently, the recipients were facing some difficulty, and many of them had wandered away. Some of them had stopped attending church, and some were reverting to Jewish practices, and the writer is clearly concerned that other people are in danger of doing that as well. we see people wander away for a variety of reasons, don't we? What are some of the reasons we see people wander away? Either like wander away from the church or wander away from the faith.
A lot of times they see somebody that is a Christian, claims to be a Christian and does something, and they're going, well, look, he's a Christian and he's doing this.
Yep. So somebody else caused them to do it. Yeah.
Church hurt.
Church hurt. Yep.
Laziness.
Laziness.
Say that.
Yep. In fact, we had one family in our church that after COVID didn't come back, and they said, well, we decided we liked watching church in our pajamas. Well, I don't know how to argue with that, really. You know, I mean, what are you gonna do? So there could be a lot of reasons. Probably some of the reasons was that it was becoming difficult. Maybe they were even having difficulty with family. I mean, you know, we've never lived with that kind of persecution, and you know, how would we handle it? Do we have the kind of faith?
Sometimes conviction, though, too.
Could be that as well. So the writer is offering warnings, but here's the deal. He's not just urging them to come back and stay. I mean, he does have this one section where he talks about let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but you don't really see him doing a lot of just, hey, come to church. Hey, don't walk away. What you see him doing is giving a very theological foundation that is very Christ-centered. And what he's doing is he's laying this foundation because what we believe affects what we do. So what he doesn't do is say, hey, y'all, do better. What he does do is say, hey, y'all, Jesus is better. Okay? That's really the theme of the letter. Jesus is better. So again, it's not a moralistic lesson, get better, do better. It's a theological lesson pointing them to Jesus, who is better. So again, the theme is Jesus is better. There's two main categories, who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. So let's look at some of the things he says about who Jesus is. Well, he's the Son of God. And as the Son of God, what he's doing is he's going to be comparing, and this is why we have a high level of confidence that a lot of these people are reverting to Jewish practices. Because what he does is he compares Jesus to pretty much everything Jewish. All right? He compares Jesus to the prophets in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He's spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom He created the world. In other words, these guys were just messengers. This guy's the heir. This is the Son. So He's better than the prophets. You're reverting to the prophets when you have something better than the prophets here. He's better than angels in verse 5 of chapter 1. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, when He brings the firstborn into the world, He says, let all God's angels worship Him. Of the angels, He says, He makes His angels winds and His ministers a flame of fire. But of the Son, He says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. In verse 13, and to which of the angels has He ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? So, Jesus is better than the prophets. Jesus is better than the angels. Angels are pretty glorious. Angels are pretty impressive. I mean, you know, you don't want to mess with an angel, right? Whenever angels showed up, people got scared. In fact, in the book of Revelation, twice, the angel that's talking to John falls down to worship the angel. The angel has to tell him no. And his point here is, you guys, some of you are getting fixated on angels, and all they do is worship Jesus. So why would you go to that? He even talks about how He's better than Moses as the Son. And you got to understand, in the Jewish mind, Moses he's the boss. I mean, this guy is the guy. Forgive me for making this comparison, but have you ever seen what happens when Muhammad gets insulted? How Muslims react? That's how large Moses was in the eyes of the Jews. Okay? I mean, he is very large in their minds, but Jesus is even greater than him because he's the Son. The prophets aren't the Son, the angels aren't the Son. And in chapter 3, verse 5, now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house. Moses is a servant in God's house. Jesus is over God's house as a son. He says, you're going back to Moses. Moses is great. I mean, he doesn't denigrate Moses at all. Moses is great. He's a faithful servant. But that's what he is. Why would you go back to that when you can have Jesus? He's greater than the priests. Man, the priests are the ones that had access to God. They're the only ones that had access to God. And the high priest is the only one that could go into the Holy of Holies, and then only one day a year. They interceded for people. They offered the sacrifice. But Jesus is a better priest. I'll talk more about that in a minute. He also tells them he's perfect. So first off, who is Jesus? He's the Son of God. Second, he's perfect. All of the heroes in the Bible, what do you know about? How many of them were perfect? How great was David? Man, our Sunday school lesson was David and Bathsheba this Sunday. I taught it. I started the class by going, I'm teaching a passage I don't like. Because it's depressing. How perfect was Moses? How perfect was Abraham? Adam? Any of the prophets? How great were the priests? They're all flawed. They're human. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he's obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for the people. Jesus didn't have to offer sacrifice for his own sins. In fact, on the Day of Atonement, sometimes you hear, well, the high priest could only go in the Holy of Holies one time a year. No, he went in twice. On the Day of Atonement, he went in twice. The first time was to sprinkle the blood for his sins and the sins of his family. Then he went out and made the sacrifice for the people. And he went into the Holy of Holies a second time and sprinkled the blood on behalf of the people. That's Leviticus 16. He's just saying, hey, all these priests, they had to make sacrifices for their own sins first. Jesus didn't have to do that. He didn't have any sin to sacrifice for. And what else do we know about the prophets, Moses and the priests? They're all dead. They're all dead, every one of them. But not Jesus. He's eternal. That's the next thing we learned about him. Hebrews 7:23. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. I like the way that's worded. To me, it's just it's a little bit humorous to me. There was a bunch of priests. You know why? They kept dying. That's what he's saying. They had to be replaced. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he's able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. He's eternal, not only forever in the future, but eternal forever in the past. There's never a time that he didn't exist. And how is it possible that he is perfect and eternal? And this is the main thing. He's actually God. He is God. Hebrews 1:3. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. This is what separates Christianity from all other religions, is this triune God. You know, we were talking the other day, they just got back from Colorado, Lance and the team just got back from Colorado where they were doing ministry to Mormons. And y'all have had Mormons tell me, you know, we believe pretty much the same thing. There's just minor differences with y'all. And I was going like, what? And they go, well, like the Trinity. Y'all, that is not a minor difference. I mean, no other religion has a God who is 3 in 1. That's a concept nobody else understands. And for them to say that's a minor difference just indicates that they don't even understand who our God is. This is about His very nature, His very identity. So those leaving were going back to something inferior. So they're wandering away. They're going back to Judaism, and He's just telling them, y'all, Jesus is so much better. And what you're doing is you're going to something inferior. Anything other than Jesus is something less than perfect, and it's not the eternal God. But He's not just amazing for who He is, but let's talk about what Jesus did. First, He lived a perfect life. Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Think about that. Temptations flew at Him, and He never ever sinned. He never violated even one of God's laws. Think about all the laws. He never violated even one in word, in thought, or in deed. Can you imagine not having a sinful thought? I'll just tell you, that's what I'm looking forward to most about eternity, is I won't sin anymore. Because I can't imagine what that's like. It means He never committed a sin, but more than that, there's also something called sins of omission. When you know to do something and you don't do it, that means He did everything He was supposed to do. Everything, 100%, all the time. So not only did He never do anything wrong, but He did everything right. Now, why does that matter to us? That matters to us because when we are judged before the throne of God, we will not be judged by our righteousness. We will be judged by His righteousness. And His righteousness is perfect. We call this the doctrine of imputed righteousness. 2 Corinthians 5:17, 5:21. He who knew no sin became sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. He credited His righteousness to our account. So because Jesus lived perfectly, we can be right with God. If Jesus had even the slightest sin, He couldn't save us from our sin. Why would you turn to anything else? What other religion, you think about it, what other religion today offers anything like this? And Judaism certainly didn't and doesn't. Not only did He live the perfect life, but He offered the perfect sacrifice. Have you ever thought of how hard a work it had to be a priest? Like, what a bloody religion. Any hunters in the room? You a hunter? You ever field dress a deer? Is it easy?
It's not too difficult.
Yeah? What if you had to do that like 50 times a day?
You'd get really good at it.
Yeah, you would, wouldn't you? It's a bloody religion. Well, that's a problem. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4 said it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It's impossible. They're killing, millions of animals. And it never took away their sins. It made them ritually clean. It made them ceremonially clean. But it didn't take away their sins. These were imperfect sacrifices offered by imperfect priests, but Jesus is the perfect priest who offered the perfect sacrifice. Hebrews 7, verse 26. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. That's never spoken of a priest in the Bible. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for His own sins and then for those of the people, since He did this once for all when He offered up Himself. These high priests, every day, they had to make sacrifices first for themselves And then they're making all these sacrifices for the people over and over and over. Then they die, they got to have more and got to have more and got to have more. And it's just this never-ending system. Jesus comes along, He makes one sacrifice sufficient for all the sins of all the people. One sacrifice for all time that worked. Hebrews 9:22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So this is something the law taught. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. The problem is, all this blood they shed never forgave sins. So He says, the blood of bulls and goats, it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to forgive sin. Blood, 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 blood. And it just never did it. But God's saying, you got to have blood. You have to have blood. You cannot be right before me without blood. Okay, here's more blood. It's not good enough. Millions of animals, the best animals. It's not good enough. I need blood. Here it is. It's not good enough. Hebrews 10, 1 through 4, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Man. They had to keep doing it. Hebrews 10, 11 through 14. Every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. You think he's trying to get a point across here? But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, He sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until His enemies should be made a footstool for His feet. For by a single offering, He has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. Every year, He makes a point to say the priest stands and does his duty. He stands and does his duty. He stands and does his duty. On the Day of Atonement, the priest goes in, he stands, he sprinkles the blood, he goes out, he makes the sacrifice for the people, he comes in, he sprinkles the blood, he goes out over and over. It's got to be done next year and next year and next year and next year. And along comes Jesus, who makes one sacrifice. And in the real holy, remember, these things are a shadow. They're not the realities. The Holy of Holies is a shadow of the Holy of Holies. Jesus walks into the Holy of Holies, sprinkles the blood, and sits down because that's His seat. He sits down. The work's finished. It's over. When He said on the cross, "It is finished," He entered His Father's glory and sat down. Why would they go back? Let's go offer some more sacrifices that can't take away our sins. And you can see that this letter is, man, it is, I think it's the weightiest. It's just of all the letters. There's 7 warnings. There's a warning against neglecting the gospel. Hebrews 2:1, therefore we must pay closer attention to what we've heard, lest we drift away from it. Notice he doesn't say, stop drifting away. Don't drift away. What does he do? Pay attention to what I'm telling you. Pay attention to the gospel. Pay attention to what you've heard. That's what will keep you from drifting away. Verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? You hear the gospel, you don't pay attention, and you walk away, how are you going to escape? I mean, that's a serious warning. It's a free gift we're given. Don't neglect it. Secondly, a warning against not believing God. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. An evil, unbelieving heart. So this is one of the reasons some people walk away, right? They just don't believe God. Does that mean they don't believe in God? I don't know. Could be. But it could be that God disappointed them. Could be they're mad at God. And they just don't believe God's who He says He is. Maybe He's out there, but He's not. I just don't believe He's going to do what He said He would do.
Didn't answer their prayer in the way that they thought.
Didn't answer their prayer. And the thing is, when everything's going great, it's easy to believe in God, isn't it? When everything's going great, it's easy to trust God. When all your bills are paid, it's easy to trust that God's going to provide for you. But when things are going south, that's when faith is essential. That's when it's hard. Take care, lest you have an evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away. It's always a matter of faith. It's always a matter of trusting God. You've got to believe. Third, there's a warning against not growing.
Not what?
Growing. Hebrews 5:12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. Man, this is a strong warning. If you're not growing in your faith, his point is, are you really even a Christian? We get videos of Lucy. We get to FaceTime with Lucy all the time. She'll be a year old in August. And we're getting to see this progression of her going from just milk to, I can't even watch the videos of reading. It's just disgusting. It's gross stuff that she eats. But some stuff she's picking up, and she's actually eating this stuff, right? Eating food. If she didn't progress, that would be very alarming, wouldn't it? If she turns 10 years old and she can only still process milk, we would say she has some sort of a serious problem. Same thing with us. This is why when I hear people talk about how they leave their church because they're just not being fed. I'm like, you've been a Christian 40 years. Have you not learned how to eat? And I don't want to denigrate the need to be fed by your teachers and your pastors to get food served to you. But at some point, you got to learn to read your own Bible. You got to learn to do your own Bible studies. Again, there's no excuse for a pastor who's not giving good food, because that's one of my jobs, right? By the way, I know on Wednesday night you come because sometimes you get really hard, tough meat. But we've got to grow. We can't just be on milk all the time. Next warning, against not persevering in holiness. Chapter 10, verse 26. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. What he's saying is, look, we're all sinners, right? But if you get saved and you just deliberately keep going in the same direction you were going, what can you expect? A fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. In other words, if you haven't been changed, are you really saved?
What was that reference?
That was 10, 26, and 27. The next warning is against losing faith. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And verse 6 says, and without faith it's impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. I've seen so many people in churches who are what I would call functional atheists. They're not atheists. They believe in God, but they live just like atheists do. There's never any faith. Never any demonstration in their life that they're trusting God. Whereas you could put their life next to an atheist and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference except they show up to church on Sunday morning. And then what he does in the rest of chapter 11 is goes through what we call the great roll call of faith, where he starts talking about all these Old Testament characters who exhibited faith to demonstrate what faith looks like. Sixth warning is against rejecting discipline. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by Him, for the Lord disciplines the one He loves and chastises every son whom He receives. He talks in here about how no discipline is pleasant at the time. By the way, parents, is it pleasant to discipline your kids? No. I never enjoyed it. My mom did. Oh, she did. She used to tell people that. She'd say, my mom, a line I heard her say so many times is, I hear people talk about how they feel worse than their kids do when they spank them. She goes, not me. It feels good to me. You never felt that way? I did. My dad would even yell at me. And the next morning I'd wake up, he's sitting on the edge of the bed waiting for me to wake up. Because he wants to apologize. Because he felt so bad. But nobody enjoys discipline. But the point is here, I had a friend that we were friends in high school, and his parents didn't discipline him. And wealthy, they were wealthy, and he came and went as he wanted. He didn't talk slack to his dad, but he talked to his mom. I mean, it was awful the way he talked to his mom. And she'd go, "Oh, Jay." And I would have been picking myself up off the floor. There wouldn't have been anything like that. And I actually realized as a teenager, I wondered, I wonder if his parents love him. And man, I had a strict mama. And I never questioned whether she loved me. I don't think she always liked me. Yeah. But we discipline our kids because we love them. And God disciplines us out of love. We're His children. Now, my parents didn't discipline my buddy Jay. Not his kids. The fact that God disciplines us is an indication that we're His children and that we're loved by Him. And then the seventh is a warning against refusing this warning. Hebrews 12:25. See that you do not refuse Him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused Him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject Him who warns from heaven. In other words, listen, y'all, it was bad enough when you rejected Moses. How much worse if you refuse warnings given by Jesus Himself? He just told them who Jesus is. There were serious consequences if you rejected Moses. But you reject this one, you're in bad shape. Jesus is just so much better. Better than what? Everything. Anything. Whatever you compare Him to, He's better. Why in the world would they revert to a system that never saved them? All these sacrifices that never made them right with God. In fact, the purpose of the sacrifices was to point them to Jesus. You need blood, and this isn't working. Prophet Isaiah comes to him and talks about this sacrifice. This one who is going to carry our sins and bear our griefs, who's going to suffer on our behalf, who will be led to slaughter like a sheep.
I think some of it's like an ingrown thing from you. That's how they were raised, though, too, whether it's wrong or not. That's all they ever knew.
And all of these sacrifices were not about the sacrifices. They were to let them know, you need the greater one that's coming. You need the greater one that's coming. So those who were saved in the Old Testament, they were not trusting the sacrifices, they were trusting the one that was coming. The once and final sacrifice. And to people flirting with walking away today, I love this in John 6, when Jesus is talking about drinking his blood and eating his flesh. And the Bible says that a lot of the people said, this is a hard saying, who can follow it? And they walked away. And it says he turned and looked at his disciples. People are walking away. He turns and looks at his disciples and said, you going with them? And what did they say?
And he said, "They'll go."
Where would we go? In fact, what I hear from reading that is that the disciples are like, yeah, this is hard. It's hard. But where would we go? Where would you go if you walk away? I'm telling you, Jesus is better than anything out there.
Yeah.
And today, whatever anybody's looking to for salvation, for happiness, for life, it won't work. Jesus is the only one who can save.